Well, hello everyone. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Good.
Good. I'm going to ask everyone except our panel to mute their microphones. Just that then we, yeah, Mom, you're already muted. Everyone's muted because then we get less feedback when we have a lot of sound coming through. Okay, I'm going to change to speaker view. Can everybody see me and everybody can hear me?
Yep. Good.
So my name is Carrie Wiens, and I am one of the co-founders of a nonprofit called Inando Development. That's a nonprofit organization in South Africa. I live in South Africa with my husband, Dan, and we visit Canada about every 2 years. Inando means overflow, and it exists to act as a catalyst for transformation. And the transformation that we speak about is holistic, which means it touches every aspect of our lives: physical, social, mental, emotional, and spiritual. And I would hope that with everybody here together today, that we would agree on this one idea, and that the world actually shouldn't be a static place. That the world, rather than seeing the disorder of the world as many physics principles say that the disorder is increasing, that we would actually see change in the world that leads to a positive, flourishing state. So that I hope we're all coming together today with that sort of agreement that transformation is possible, and that transformation can be holistic. It can be in all the different spheres of our life. Our current reality, however, has us being impacted by COVID-19. And the interesting observation I have about COVID is actually that it's impacting us in a very holistic way, because there's physical implications on our health. There's social implications on how it's been affecting our society. There's been mental and emotional implications on how that's affecting how we think and how we feel. And finally, there's implications on the deepest part of ourselves, on our souls, and on our spiritual beings. So COVID has almost shown us that the world is connected, and that if transformation is to happen, we need to have a 360-degree approach to that. And that's what our panel is about today. Today, we are using this opportunity to come out of our isolation in all our different parts of Canada, to gather and to talk about flourishing. And to flourish is to thrive, to prosper, and to grow. And many people might even have the question of, can we even flourish in times like this? Well, we're going to discuss today how flourishing has many interconnected aspects, and that it starts in the physical world with the soil, but extends to what we eat, how we take care of our bodies, and how we interact in this world. So we're providing this forum. It's a place to enhance ideas and creativity. We don't profess to have all the answers today, but we believe that there's knowledge and expertise from individual experience that we can share and benefit from. The format of today is 1.5 hours. We're going to begin with introductions and sort of get a sense of where everybody is at, and then also introduce our panel. So I am going to ask right now if everybody if you can unmute your microphone just quickly and say your name and where you are from.
You're going to have to cue people, maybe.
Yeah, Rob, why don't you start?
I'm
Hi,
Rob Lavoie. Oh, sorry.
That's okay. There's two of us. Go, Rob.
There's two. Rob Lavoie. I run a little company called Air Terra, which stands for taking carbon out of the air, putting it in the terra. We do that with biochar as a soil amendment product.
Okay, Herda?
Hi, I'm Gerda Van Heerden from South Africa originally. So that's where my passion is. And my husband and I are leading the missions ministry at Powers Creek Church. And so that's why we are very interested, and we started to sponsor you a little bit this year. So we are getting involved in your beautiful ministry, and I'm very excited because we are from South Africa, and that's a huge passion of ours.
Wonderful. And Faya?
My name is Fayaz. I am originally from Pakistan, and now I am teaching at the School of International Development and Global Studies, University of Ottawa.
Wonderful to have you. Thank you. Uncle Merv?
Mervyn and Lucille Traub from Didsbury, Alberta.
Wonderful.
We're retired.
Paul? Paul Wiens, Dad?
Hi, we're Paul and Debbie Wiens from Kelowna.
We're Dan's mom and dad.
Dad's mom and dad. Cheryl?
Hi, we're Lyndon and Cheryl Sadowski. We're based in Edmonton, Alberta, and we've known Dan and Carrie for, I guess, 20 years and have supported them since they started this work.
And we're not retired. We're trying to work from home.
Sally. Hi, Sally. I don't know if she can hear us. Sally's a friend of Barb's, a good friend from Ottawa area. How about Glenda?
Hi, I'm from Lethbridge, Alberta, and I'm basically here to check out what you guys are up to. I probably won't be able to stay for a full hour and a half.
Oh, no problem. Gail?
Hi. Yeah, my husband Stephen and I are missionaries in Cape Town, South Africa, and I'm really fascinated with farming God's way, and I'm interested in what I might learn this evening.
Wonderful. And Chris and Barbara?
Hi, Chris isn't watching, it's just me. I was so impressed with your talk last week in Pat and Lucas's group. And I'm really interested. I'm a gardener, and I'm a nurse as well, but I won't probably be able to stay for the whole hour and a half, but I'm very interested.
Wonderful. Wayne?
Hi, I'm Wayne Broadland from Waterloo, Ontario. I remember when you spoke at Trinity EMC a couple of years ago, and what you said made so much sense to me. So I'm involved in Trinity. I'm lead elder. I'm also, I stepped away from the university a couple of years ago so I could work with E3 Partners. So I don't know if you know them, but that's my new hat.
Nice. Wonderful. And Rob Regal?
Calgary, Alberta.
Wonderful.
I'm a gardener.
Yeah.
Nice.
Lois? Her microphone is muted.
You can unmute her.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I know Dan and Carrie from Center Street, and it's been my privilege to walk with them as the partner care person for our global workers. And I'm a Calgary gardener, which means lots of failure.
Great. Hi, Tanya.
Hello, I'm from BC as well, and I'm part of the missions team at Powers Creek, and we're really excited to watch your video in the missions team, and yeah, just want to learn more about what you're doing. I'm originally from Kenya. My parents were missionaries. So yeah, I think it's really cool. I'm excited to be here.
Wonderful. Mark, I'm not sure if I did you, Mark. Yeah, she's not there. And then Hez.
Did you mean me?
Okay, hi, yeah, hi Mark. We can't see your video, so okay, well, we've got a great group here, and I'm just going to ask you all to mute your microphones, except the panel leaders. And now I'm going to introduce our panel. We have Stan Wiens, who is a good friend. We have worked with Stan. I can remember Stan gave some leadership to us when we were working with him, and he was such a breath of fresh air to work under as a leader, a real man who empowers people. And so I'm excited for him to share a little bit of what's going on. Stan, can you just give us a little bit of a background on your passions and why you're interested in being a part of the panel today?
Yeah, well, it's an easy answer because I love health. I love nutrition. I love the idea that God created everything we need to be healthy. And typically what we need as humans is just a way to respond in its simplest way, because the world, the health industry creates so much confusion for people and so much unhealth in even how they approach it. So it's just an area that after 20 years of being in pastoral ministry, which I was still doing all this stuff in that time, it is just something that really connected with me. So I've started this as sort of my full-time endeavor.
Nice.
But I have many passions. I could get into mountain running, all kinds of activities, but I just love just helping people pretty much just take one step forward and get moving in the right direction.
Yeah, well, what I find so interesting, Stan, is, you know, you have followed a passion for transformation through health. You know, you've left sort of a more stable career to go into something, you know, that's really, yeah, that's really pioneering. And so, you know, I think for people to follow a passion that takes them a little bit outside of their comfort zone, it gives them an interesting platform to speak to us from.
Absolutely. It's what I teach my kids, and then I finally started doing it myself.
Yeah.
Nice.
And so I also want to introduce Barbara Warren. Barbara is a very good friend and somebody that's influenced my life significantly right from when I was a teenager. We, as teenagers, often were at their homestead in the Ottawa area, going out on hay rides, helping with taking in the hay, learning how to grow vegetables. So basically, she has influenced me right from an early age. Barb, can you just tell us a little bit about your passion?
Well, obviously my passion is gardening. Sorry about the phone. Good thing I have somebody else in the house. We should have put it on mute. Yes, gardening as it applies here is it's part of my life. And I can tell you my philosophy. Sorry, guys.
It's okay.
It's fine.
My philosophy of gardening and growing your own things began when my kids were quite small. And, you know, children are influenced by so many things as to foods. They're by the media, by television, by having birthday parties and overnights, sleepovers and everything. They're influenced by how other people eat. And so a lot of what other people eat or feed their children is not what I would feed my children. And so I think I, at some point, started thinking very seriously about how do I respond to Mom, why don't we do, or why don't we eat, or can we have? And I came up with that it's important to eat things as closely to the way that they're grown as possible. And if you look at what's on the grocery shelves in the middle of the store, that's none of those things. Around the outside of the store, it is those things, but many of those things, of course, have been on trucks or other places for maybe up to a week or two, so they aren't fresh either. So I'm an outside girl, and gardening just came about.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
Barb, I have never met you until today, and I'm already your friend.
Oh, thanks, Dan. We can be friends. That's great.
And then let me introduce my husband, Dan. Dan has always loved growing things. He has grown in Edmonton. Well, he's done some growing things in Ontario. He's grown things in Edmonton. He's grown things in Calgary, and now he gets to grow things in South Africa, which is a beautiful environment for growing things. So why don't you talk a little bit about your passion?
Like Stan, well, like all of us, I have a number of passions as well, and one of them is growing food and also empowering people to grow their own food, teaching people. I also have a passion for addressing mindsets. So for example, in our ministry in Africa, where we're teaching people to grow food, the mindset there, for example, is predominantly one of scarcity and one of we can't succeed because we don't have X, Y, or Z. We don't have a tractor, we don't have irrigation, we don't have chemical fertilizers. And one of our passions in UNDO development and also on the model farm is addressing those mindsets head on to really take the blinders off in terms of opening people's eyes to the abundance of natural resources that God has provided, and then teaching them to use what is readily at hand to provide not just food, but abundance in other ways to provide for their families from what God has already provided. So what we see in Africa is a lot of urbanization. People have left their family homesteads. They're leaving the land empty. In South Africa, a small percentage of land, arable land in South Africa is actually being farmed. And that's because people have left their lands to get jobs in the cities that don't actually exist. So challenging people to, who are now potentially in an urban setting, to challenge them to go back to their farms, go back to their lands, grow their own food, start selling food to their neighbors in their communities, gaining not just food for the table, but a sustainable income and providing for their families that way. So one of our passions is to alleviate poverty, but we call it breaking the yoke of poverty. Scripture talks about breaking the spiritual yokes and the yokes of poverty, and that's the business that we're involved in community development. One of our philosophies in community development is it really is addressing mindset, addressing identity, teaching people who they are in Christ, teaching them how to be in the world and how to utilize the abundance of natural resources that God has given.
Yeah, exactly. And what I'm challenging everyone today to do is, now we have these 3 panel speakers, is to try and identify the connections, because that's really what this panel is about, is that everything is connected. There's a holistic view that we're trying to achieve today. So Stan, I want to start with you. You've been on this health journey and well-being journey for years now. What have you learned about the human body and how God designed it?
Well, that's a small question. So, and first, because some of you are going to have to exit early, if there's anything I say that maybe is confusing, because you can kind of lean into a topic, but then there's much you can't explain, right? And so I can't touch on every element of what I mean by a healthy lifestyle, or all these things that I'm going to throw out to you in the next little while. But if you just go to thehealthproject.ca, which is my website, you can get resources there. They're all free, other than my coaching. I'm very expensive. And also, you can just email me. I love interacting with people and just guiding people sort of offline from coaching, just in case I was confusing on a certain issue or things like that, because I kind of get amped up and I start communicating, and that means I'm going to leave things out. But, to say about what can we learn, like over the 20 or so years I've been on this journey, first of all, I want to say, what have I learned about God's design is the fact it's a journey. You will not do well to say that I need to get to a certain place by a certain time, or I need to adopt this whole new lifestyle. I think what we do is we learn and we absorb information, and then we begin to take steps. And I think what I see happening culturally is that we just surrender to the myth that I'm stuck or I can't take steps. And so my go-to is just identify one thing, begin to move forward. And the reason why I focus first of all on starting with God's design. So whether you are a follower of Jesus or not, it still makes sense, because what I'm going to say is backed by science. Other faith communities have a high appreciation for God and for how they treat their bodies. And so, but I speak as a Christian, as a follower of Jesus, and I think that God has given us some great tools. And so I'm going to just start with, we function best when we honor God with our bodies, our physical, and when I say our bodies, I mean our physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual health, and understanding the deeply related or intertwined nature of all these elements. They all matter. And, you know, we try to separate them, and separating these areas creates great harm, especially when it comes to, I see this often in churches where we'll heighten spirituality above the physical. And the Apostle Paul even said, you know, that's dualism or Gnosticism. He even had a great fancy word for it called docetism, that when we elevate the spiritual above the physical, we minimize what God has done in creation.
Yeah.
So that's the first thing I would say. Another thing that I've learned about just following God's lead in a healthy lifestyle is that we need to have grace. Because the trillion-dollar health industry is using body shaming, guilt, and a lot of pseudoscience, for lack of a better word, to get us moving in the right direction. And I think that we do better when we have grace. I extend grace to you, you extend grace to me as we go in this journey, because it doesn't matter how we've done in the past. What matters is what you're coming to understand about your health and where you're going to go from here. And I think every one of you today are going to make some new decisions. And I think that's going to be like, what's my next step from here in farming, in caring for creation, in caring for myself? Another thing that I understand from God's design specifically, and Carrie, I know you can just say, time out, Stan, you're getting a little bit too amped up there. Just give me some kind of signal and I'll ease up. But when we follow God's design, and I'm going to be really clear about that as we go through this time together, is that we're just going to feel better. When we move from refined or highly processed food towards whole food, as Barb was already saying, we will naturally begin to feel better. The average Canadian, and I speak typically in the Canadian context, 50% of their nutrition is coming from highly refined or highly processed food, as Barb said, in the middle of the grocery store. And it's doing great harm. We don't need to get rid of it all. I love fun food, all those good things, but we do better when we move from processed towards whole. The other thing is we do better when we move from a sedentary lifestyle towards being active. So I think those two things are just very much built right into how God designed us. And for all of human history, and I find this fascinating, for all of human history until the last few decades, those have been values culturally. Now we have different values. We value, we can have whatever we want, whenever we want, and however much we want. And friends, that's killing us.
Yeah.
And it also goes against even just God's gift of grace to each other. So the other thing that I see just in the natural, and I'll just kind of stop with this, is I think when we see and look at God's design, we actually have when we follow those two principles of being active and moving towards whole food, again, not in a perfect way, we're not about that, but we begin to actually have a stronger immune system. I mean, very appropriate for, you know, how we're all feeling these days, a stronger immune system, but even more importantly, as we get older in our 60s, 70s, and 80s, the ability to fight many of the chronic disease that is running rampant through culture, whether it's type 2 diabetes, heart disease, stroke, dementia, all these things. Not in a perfect way, but I think we can do a great deal of honoring God in how we approach these things, and even having an effect on overall health in the big picture, especially as we age.
So what's interesting, Stan, is I'm already hearing connections, because you're talking about sort of a lifestyle change and taking responsibility and taking one step at a time. And I'm going to get Dan to jump in right away and speak from the perspective of people that don't have the resources that we have here in North America, and particularly sort of the people that we work with. What similarities are you seeing in mindset change and in taking these steps towards transformational living that applies the similarities to our context in South Africa?
Like some of the themes that Stan was talking about.
Yeah.
So in South Africa, just like in the West here, I would say the majority of people, regardless of socioeconomic status, have bought into the illusion that money gets you food, and we get food from the grocery store. And it's ironic anywhere, but it's especially ironic in South Africa, where you can grow food all year round and there's land all over the place. And people are poor. The majority of South Africans are poor. We have I don't know the percentage, but many people who are living on $2 a day or less, particularly in the informal settlements in South Africa. And they've left their homelands, they've left their and they're looking for money. They're looking for government handouts so that they can go to the grocery store and buy their refined corn flour, which is, there's not much health in there at all. So I always come back to this mindset issue of challenging our assumptions and allowing the analyses of our assumptions to move us in a better direction. Like Barb was saying, let's get back to the land, let's get back to where eating food that's as close to the land as possible, and gaining health and strength the way God intended it from the beginning. I agree with you, Stan. The highly refined foods are making us sick. We're seeing it all over in the West, but we're seeing it in South Africa. South Africa has some of the highest rates of hypertension, obesity, diabetes, and heart disease, and this is among the poor. The poor in South Africa are overweight and have hypertension and have diabetes. Why is that? It's because they're taking their government handout money and they're going and they're buying refined food. And they're not eating enough fresh fruits and vegetables. They're filling up on these empty calories, and the health is suffering in a big way. I'm shuddering to think of what happens, for example, with COVID or any other disease that comes through South Africa in a big way, with compromised immune systems based on diet, but also compromised immune systems because of high rates of HIV, for example, HIV and AIDS in South Africa. So it's a huge issue.
And I think what we need to understand is that regardless of our socioeconomic background, to make a change is difficult. You know, Stan, you're talking about a Canadian making a change in their health. To create new habits is difficult. It's just as difficult for someone in a poor economic background to make a change, to move from a stifling life to a flourishing life. And so that's what I want us all to see today as these connections, as we can all be connected in the sense that we're all humans, and transformation is long, slow, and painful. It's difficult. And I'm hoping today that you're going to go away with some tools that help you think about transformation in a different way. And also maybe you can be a part of encouraging other people to embrace transformation in their lives. I'd like to move to Barb.
Sorry, can I just want to reinforce something Stan said, is that the journey in health or growing food or these things, it's a journey. And so the question isn't how do we go from A to Z? The question is, what are my next couple of steps?
Yeah, it'd be great if everybody had a piece of paper and was just writing down some of the practical next steps that are coming out of this for you. So Barb, I want to jump to you because I'd like you to share specifically how growing food and working in a garden and in the soil has impacted your life.
You might be muted.
Are you muted? Just one sec, let me check.
We do want you to share, Barb, but we're going to have to.
Sorry.
You should be on.
You're on now, Barb. So let's try that. Oh, no, you're not on. There
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Good.
Sorry
Okay.
about
I'm all set. My backup was coming to help me out. I think it can be wrapped up in 2 words: health and happiness.
Wonderful.
Nice.
Mm-hmm.
They really come together, I think, especially for me. Health, because, like I said before, I'm growing my own food. It's fresh. There's nothing like the taste of fresh food. And most people that shop at the grocery store don't understand what broccoli tastes like or what spinach tastes like, really. And I have a story about that. And then I had a grandson who hated broccoli. And when he came to my house, I had this no thank you portion, you know, which is a tablespoon. So I put a tablespoon of broccoli on his plate and he says, "Oh, Grandma." And I said, "I'm sorry, but you need to learn how to eat broccoli." And so he, you know, put a piece in his mouth and he said, "Oh, this is good." Because it came out of my garden and it had only been out of my garden less than an hour probably, right? So, you know, that's just something that reinforces the idea that, yes, fresh is not only good tasting, but it also is very nourishing because there's been lots of studies that indicate that so many hours out of the ground or cut off or what you do to harvest it, the nutritional benefit of that keeps going down and down. So for me, as far as the growing and the eating, that's the big part there. Now, as far as, and that's the health part, but the happy part comes from, man, you just can't work in the garden and not be happy because the soil gives you energy, the little plants growing, it's a nurturing experience, the sunshine on your back, there's just so many things that feed your soul and feed your spirit when you're out in the garden. And for me, I've had the privilege of always having a garden where I can experience a lot of the world. I can experience trees and fields and things like that. And so, you know, you get out in the garden early in the morning and the dew's still on the grass and the air is nice and fresh and nobody's going to work yet. And so there's minimal car traffic. And it's like, wow, God, what a great thing, you know? So
awesome.
That's the happy part, right? So does that answer your question, I think?
Yeah, and I mean, the application for me, I even think of people that are struggling and how healing an activity it would be to get involved in something where you're nurturing, where you're giving back to something.
Yeah, and is it okay, Carrie, if I just comment on something Barb just said? Because the happiness factor cannot be underestimated. I was just reading a book by, I don't know if you've ever heard of the author, John Robbins. His dad was the actual founder of Baskin and Robbins. But John Robbins took on an incredibly healthy lifestyle. And he did a study, and a lot of people have referred to these areas as blue zones in the world where the healthiest and happiest, longest living people are on planet Earth. And as much as I talk about nutrition and exercise as keys to having a healthy lifestyle, what they found around the world is that when you include the reduction of anxiety, which our Western culture just pounds on us, but you also up the happiness or joy factor, people just live longer.
Mm, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
There have been, this was a while ago, and I'm sorry I can't cite the study, but I did read a study years ago about the effects of getting your fingers in the soil on mood, on immunity, on, like Barb was saying, happiness. And there's growing evidence that interacting with soil microbes in the soil have a direct impact on your state of mind. I'm not sure we know why yet, but it's...
Yeah, you actually breathe in things. I mean, the funny word that some people use for it is forest bathing. When you're out in creation and you're touching real things that God made, there's something in our soul, in our hearts, even in our physiology that just respond beautifully.
And gardening is a parallel to so many other creative, I don't know if I want to say creative processes. You know, the seed and then the growth and all of that process. It's in the Bible, they talk about the spiritual application of that, and yet we see it in nature and in gardening. And I think it's pretty amazing.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I think it would be a great time to just go to Dan and talk about sustainable farming and specifically about soil fertility. Can you speak to that a bit?
Yeah, and if I use a tool called Farming God's Way, and so I often use the term farming or sustainable farming. When I say farming, I also include gardening on whatever scale. And I'll come back to this later, but it's really not about scale. It's about some of these principles. So sustainable farming or sustainable gardening is where the farm or the field or the garden or the flower bed and the surrounding ecosystem and the soil improve over time. So there's a lot to consider there. In Genesis 2, it talks about how God plants a food garden in the east of Eden, and then he places Adam in the garden to do two things, to work and to care for it. And one of the principles there is as we work and care for the garden flourishes, the garden improves, the soil improves, the ecosystem improves. We get to look after creation, and as we look after creation, creation looks after us. Modern industrial agriculture is on the other end of the spectrum of this idea of increasing fertility, increasing flourishing, and an improved ecosystem over time. We're actually doing the opposite through monocropping and reliance on chemical fertilizers. So sustainable farming is where things are improving. And over time, the quality of our crops improve, but crucially, the soil is improving in its fertility, in its life, in its biology, and the surrounding ecosystem. Monocropping is one of the things that's really harming our ecosystem, and we're learning this, for example, in our pollinators, where large studies of colony collapse disorder among honeybees, they're trying to figure out what is going on here, and it's looking like it's a multifactorial thing. It's not just one thing. It's not just neocotinid chemicals, for example, which was the big one and maybe the biggest factor, but it turns out that honeybees need a variety of forage to have a healthy colony. And when we're planting hundreds and thousands of acres, for example, of canola, and that's all the bees are getting, the bee colonies are suffering. And that's just a picture of how the ecosystem is actually suffering under our modern industrial agriculture. I think that the second thing I would say about sustainable farming is an economic sustainability where we're not reliant on large amounts of chemical fertilizers. The economics of farming is completely reliant on cheap oil, because it requires a lot of energy to manufacture these chemicals. At the moment, oil is cheap, but we can't assume that oil is going to remain cheap. Where if it takes 20 years, 50 years, or 100 years to see oil become very expensive, we're going to see food becoming very expensive, and that's because fertilizers are becoming very expensive. So this reliance on fertilizers, there's an economic cost, but there's also an ecological cost. Fertilizers, heavy amounts of fertilizers acidify the soil, and they destroy the biology in the soil. I think the third thing I would say, and I'm blasting through this stuff just for time, there's so much to unpack here. But getting back to the soil and soil fertility, sustainable farming or sustainable gardening is where your soil volume increases over time. God's given us the ability to actually work with creation to create soil, so that the soil profile actually grows over time. What we're finding in areas like Africa, where we're heavily reliant on plowing, for example, is that the soil profile collapses over time and there's heavy amounts of erosion. So we're actually wasting the soil. We're seeing it wash out to sea.
Welcome.
The history of Western agriculture is largely a history of soil erosion and compaction. It's not sustainable. Part of the expansion of the West was depleting the soils I'm talking about North America, depleting the soils in the East through the eastern part of the continent through compaction and soil erosion, and then farmers needing to move west to find fertile soil to sustain crops again. So that's not a sustainable way to do it. Thankfully, in Canada especially, and America, we've learned to grow crops without heavy amounts of tillage, but we've got a ways to go yet in terms of looking after the biology in the soil and the fertility of the soil.
So what's interesting is you can kind of see this big picture of we're all dependent on the land and the soil that we stand on. Like, all of us are connected because we all eat food, and our food is all coming from somewhere, and it's all coming from soil, unless it's grown in a greenhouse, I guess, where they just have that fertigation processing. So I want to go back to Bob. And Barb, if you can maybe speak to one of your growing seasons. So we're looking at this big picture, but now we're looking at somebody that's actually applied this for most of her life, what her growing season looks like, and what she has noticed about her garden, her environment, relating to some of these bigger issues that Dan was talking about.
Okay, so my growing season where I live, last frost date is about the end of May. First frost date is, last. And the first in the fall is, well, in Ottawa, it would probably be the 1st of September, but I think in Elgin, where I am now, it's probably closer to the 1st of October. So everything that we eat fresh from the garden has to happen in that period of time. And planting a garden is, it's for me, because my garden is not just a summer garden. My garden is I eat from my garden 10 or 12 months of the year because I put food up. I freeze it, or I can it, or I store it. So I'll deal with the fresh first, okay? So some things can be put in the garden before the last frost date, and so those would be things like, and of course those are the things we eat first, right? So they would be things like spinach and lettuce and kale and radishes and peas. I could probably plant those anytime now, and then by the 1st of June I could easily be eating those. Not the peas, everything but the peas. And then once the last frost date happens, well, let me backtrack. I can also plant onions and carrots and beets because they don't seem to mind the frost a little bit, but I can't eat those until later, maybe July. So then after the last frost date, which would be the end of May, I can plant my squashes, summer squashes, winter squashes, corn, my tomato plants and my pepper plants, and any of my herbs, beans. Oh, I could plant cabbages and broccoli soon as well. Anyway, so then So I've eaten my lettuce and I've eaten my peas, and now I can eat my carrots and my beets, but I only eat some of them because I want to store some of those, right? I don't want to store the peas, just the carrots and the beets. So then we come to, and the squashes, summer squashes. The summer squashes are so prolific that whether I like it or not, I have to put some of them up because I can't eat them all at the time. And then we come to the tomatoes and the peppers and the corn and more of everything that I had in July. So, you know, summer cabbage is ready, and the things that you don't eat in the heat of the summer are the things that don't like heat, which are the lettuces and spinach and peas. So once it gets hot, they say, so long, see you next year, or you can plant them again in the fall when it's cool. So that's basically my summer garden. So when we, and I'll make this quick so you don't run out of time. So once the frost hits in September, then we dig up the potatoes and we dig up the carrots and the beets, and we pick the squashes and let them harden out in the weather. And what else? Oh, the onions. Oh, and we also harvest garlic in July. So we have nice fresh garlic then. And we put all those things in the cold storage. And so that plus canning tomato soup and making salsa and freezing soups out of the vegetables, the squashes, and freezing casseroles using broccoli and stuff like that. When I have too much of it and I just can't eat anymore at that time, I can enjoy now. So I have tomato soup in my basement, and I have broccoli casserole in my freezer, and yeah.
It's honestly, Barb, it's truly inspiring. Like, I mean, I remember living at your house during asparagus season, and we had asparagus for breakfast, lunch, and supper, and it was the most delicious thing, you know, I've ever.
We loved it.
Yeah, I loved it. So I'm going to jump back to Stan now. Stan, like, as you're hearing Barb talk about all of this food that she's growing, and you know the process that you've gone through in your life of health promotion and that kind of stuff, what are some practical steps that you feel that we can take starting today in wanting to improve our health based on all of these connections that we're talking about?
Yeah, well, I mean, the whole matter is very practical. I mean, Barb's already said it. The closer you can be to the original source of the food, and the closer you can be to it, the better. So for me, a practical step, just to respond to her gardening passion, would be to find your farmer's market and stay away from the supermarket as much as possible. And try to find your local farmer would be even one step better, and to try to buy directly right off somebody's sustainable farm. And I mean, I've grown up, I'm an urban guy. I got a new neighbor. We just moved to a new house. And so one practical step for me is I'm going to learn, and I'm going to build, learn, and develop like a little garden box. I mean, so in my yard, that's the space I have. But there's a few people that have done that together, and some of them are going to focus on different vegetables at different times. And we're going to work as a little collective right here in Haysboro, Calgary. So I'm excited about that. I'm the newbie. So Barb, if you could fly over and just kind of hold my hand to go through that process, that would be great. But, you know, that is, the key question is like, how simple and how practical can you make this? Because moving towards, I mean, I would love to be a gardener. We're not all gardeners. I would love that everybody would be very active and eat exceptionally well and experience the clear mind that comes with that, and all the gifts that God gives us when we respond in this way. I do see health as a spiritual discipline, but that is the key question, is like, how do I take just one step forward? And so from a very practical standpoint, the way I typically coach someone is to identify one area that you want to work on. Again, like I did not conquer this, nor have I conquered it. It's a lifelong journey. So I would say, think about, how much refined sugar you're eating. Is there one way you can reduce that? Is there, how much refined flour are you eating? I mean, I love to joke around a lot, but I mean, the reality is the whiter the bread, the sooner you're dead.
Oh my goodness.
To get as much to the whole grain as possible and all those things. But okay, so from a practical standpoint, I would say choose one thing, pick a start date, and then do it for 2 months. That is the most practical advice. I mean, I published a journal. It's called the Habit Journal. It's just simply, you could do this on your own. You don't need my Habit Journal to do this. Just do that. Pick an item, choose a start date, track it for 3 months or 2 months. And then once you get to the end of 2 months, it's likely that one item has become more of a habit, a lifestyle. And I would much rather see, again, I know this is very, very practical, and some people say, that's too simple. I need more of a radical overhaul. Well, can I just say kindly, that's nonsense. If you go on a diet or you get a gym membership, you're going to quit. They always do. At least 90% of the people do. The reality is people get further just doing one thing at a time for 2 months. And think about it. In 1 year from today, every one of us on this screen will have developed potentially 6 new lifestyle habits. So you could pick one in the area of just learning and leadership, but you could also pick something in just being active. Park your car 10 minutes away from the office if we ever get to go back to our offices. But that's like, I was coaching somebody yesterday and she goes, I don't know how to ingrain it into my day because I'm so busy. I just say, well, why don't you park your car at this parking lot and walk to work? And then at the end of the day, you can go past your car. If you don't, at least you got 20 minutes of walking. So I usually say identify an activity and identify maybe a nutritional trade-off. Like, I'm gonna now have blueberries instead of a blueberry Pop-Tart. Like simple little things, but don't try to do too much too quickly. That's where people fail. So if that's the only thing I can pass on to you from a practical standpoint, I would say just see it as a journey. And I would say more profoundly as a follower of Christ, see it as a spiritual journey because it's not separated as we talked about at the beginning.
That's wonderful. I love that idea of choosing one thing and trying it for 2 months. And so in about 5 minutes, we are going to take some questions. And so I'd like you, I see that there's already one question on the chat group. I'd like you, if you have a question, to put it on the chat group. And I'll try and pull a couple of those questions to pose to our panel. I just want to close with going back to Dan and having him respond. So Stan, you're talking about choosing one thing to do differently. Dan, can you maybe talk about the top 3 gardening practices that we teach to small-scale farmers in South Africa that people can even apply one of those practices that would improve their gardening application?
Yeah, so Farming God's Way, there's 3 categories of teaching that we do. There's spiritual, there's the practical or technological, and then there's management keys. But I'll just talk about the technological or the how-to. I would say a few things. Everything goes back to the soil. So for those of you who are maybe inspired to try to grow something this season, maybe you haven't ever before and you're just going to grow one thing, I just want to encourage you, think about the soil. Anybody who farms or gardens, I'm always telling them, forget about the plants, worry about the soil. So 3 things. The first principle, minimum soil disturbance. We don't go with a hoe and mix up the soil. I can't take the time to go into all the reasons for that, but practice minimum soil disturbance. as little as possible. If you need to disturb a little bit of soil to put some organic input into the ground, some fertilizer, that's fine. But don't, I was saying to somebody yesterday, everyone who has a rototiller
needs to throw it out.
Needs to sell it or throw it away, because it does more harm than good. Minimum soil disturbance. Tilling the soil creates huge compaction problems and huge erosion problems. It creates perfect conditions for soil erosion and compaction. Don't have time to go into the reasons for that, but minimum soil disturbance. Secondly, a thick mulch cover, 2.5 or 3 centimeters, keep that soil covered. A mulch cover both protects and feeds the biology in the soil. And the biology is where your fertility is. Chemistry is important, physics of the soil is important, but the biology is crucial. It's the biology, the microbes and the insects and the earthworms that are transforming the mineral content of that soil into a form that the plant can take up. So when we're feeding, we can't directly feed plants, but we can directly feed the soil and the soil biology. And the best way to do that, 2 things. We're going to use organic inputs. Every time you plant, you should put something in the soil. And this is the 3rd principle, is we're going to use organic inputs. Those inputs include, number 1, compost. By far the best soil amendment and fertilizer you can use. If you don't have access to compost, we can use manure. And then the last 2 I'll mention are wood ash, brilliant for the soil, and also bone meal. Those mitigate acidic soils and they provide micronutrients to the soil. Yeah, so just to summarize those 3 things, minimum soil disturbance, keep the soil covered, 2.5 to 3 centimeters of soil cover. By the way, on that note, sunlight sanitizes soil. It actually kills the soil biology in the top 4 inches of the soil. If you keep that soil covered, it protects the biology in the soil from being killed by the radiation. And then thirdly, organic inputs. Always put something back in the soil before you plant, ideally compost, otherwise manure, and wood ash and bone meal are also brilliant additives for your soil.
Great, so I've got a few questions coming up here. I'm going to throw these to the panel and you guys can decide. How much would store vegetable prices change if the plants were grown in bulk by the sustainable farming practices that we've been talking about today? Does anybody have any idea what the cost factor would be on that?
I know, I think that it would be an awful lot more as we move away from monoculture, but I do not have the experience to say that. But what I would say is the more we start to trend our human, as culture trends towards maybe more organic or healthy food choices, the more commercialization or the marketplace will grow those items, and maybe more small farms would come into existence to supply that need because we're so market driven. So I think it would take some time. So a lot of my people that I'm coaching, when I'm doing a workshop at a church, for example, we'll talk about, well, but if we move to all that stuff you're saying, it's going to be so expensive. And that's true. But I think we can start to make trade-offs and look at also how much we consume and how we don't have to have, for example, meat every single day. Like we can start to kind of trade off some of the things that we do eat. As a culture, it's surprising, but the average Canadian is consuming about 3,000 calories a day when 2,000 is about what you need. So if you think about that, if you want to save a third of your food budget, just eat the calories you actually need, not all the stuff you want. But that's just one perspective, and I have no idea how it would impact the pricing.
Yeah, I also don't have a direct answer to the question, but one thing I would say in relation to this question is, it seems to me that we've put convenience and low cost at the top of our priority list when it comes to our food purchasing choices. And those priorities, in my view, need to change. What's the cost, for example, of chronic illness due to insufficient nutrient intake? Because we're eating a lot of refined foods, or because even the few vegetables that we grow, as Barb was saying, were harvested 2 or 3 weeks ago, or we're grown in a greenhouse using water-soluble chemicals instead of in healthy, fertile soil. These are considerations we need to think, we need to bring more to the forefront. What's your health worth, for example? What is ecological sustainability worth to us? It's something we don't even think about typically when we go to the grocery store. How was this food grown, and what's been the ecological damage in growing it? There aren't easy answers to those questions, but considering those questions is part of the journey that I think we should as Christ followers be on.
Here's a really great question from Rosemary. If you want to move from like a lawn to a vegetable garden in a yard, what would be some of the first steps to healthy soil that should be taken?
I often answer questions like this as here's what I would do. If I had a lawn and I wanted to convert that to a garden, here's what I would do. I would take the long-term view. At this point in the spring, for me, it's getting a bit, if you really wanted to get after it this season, you can. It's going to be a lot of work. If you took a longer-term view, you could start small in containers this season and make a plan for next season. I would find a lot of mulch cover in the fall and put a good 10 or 15 centimeter covering on the area that I wanted to plant next season. That covering is going to kill the grass, because taking lawn out is an awful lot of work. I might put that time into container gardening this season and get ready for planting next season when that grass is good and dead from the heavy mulch cover. And then make a plan for how I'm going to grow for next season, do my research on varieties and seeds, and which is a lot of fun.
Yeah, Barb.
Go ahead.
No, Barb, you chime in.
Or you could kind of take a middle route. Instead of going just container gardening, you could do raised beds.
Yes.
Yeah.
I love raised beds.
Yes. And that is kind of a middle size, let's say, while all of your mulching your lawn, or however you're going to kill the grass. So do the raised beds for this year, and then do your garden on your lawn for next year, and use your raised beds for things that take up too much space, like squashes or pumpkins or cucumbers or something like that.
Yeah, and I mean, I would say the most important thing is when you're removing that grass, you're just, you're trying to cut the grass off the top of your soil, but you're not disturbing the soil underneath. And as soon as you've got the grass off the soil, then you're covering it with your mulch. And as soon as the mulch goes down, it begins conditioning the soil. So if you go to the Ananda Development page, you can see some of the videos of how we prepared our first maize field. And we went from grass to planting in about 2 months through the whole, so you can actually see what we did there. There's videos. So hope maybe that would help. Somebody had a really good question. Is it safe to collect leaves from my neighbor's garden and use that as mulch?
Leaves are a wonderful mulch material. They're one of the best because they're full of micronutrients that were taken from deep in the soil by the trees. Any kind of mulch material you use, you kind of want to know what the history of that was. For example, were pesticides and herbicides used in the area? But in general, leaves are brilliant. Is it safe to collect leaves from my neighbors? I guess that depends on your relationship with your neighbor.
And how your neighbor gardens.
And how your neighbor gardens. For me, nobody's going to take leaves from my yard. They're too valuable to me.
Well, and the other thing we often talk about is that the ecosystem, if you have a healthy ecosystem in your yard, if you're bringing bad bugs into your yard and you have a healthy ecosystem, your good bugs will tend to eat your bad bugs. So, I mean, what we're trying to do in our gardens is create that healthy system where the bad bugs aren't overtaking the good bugs. And if you have a pest problem, it's usually a soil problem and it's usually a balance problem. So I personally wouldn't be afraid of bringing leaves from somebody else's garden. I don't think, even if they coughed on them and put coronavirus on them, I don't even think the coronavirus would last. But I'm not a medical expert.
Just saying.
Another really good question here is, how can we establish a way to be connected as gardeners? I think that's a great question. What I have done is on Facebook, I have started a group called Flourishing from the Soil on Up. It's a group you can join on Facebook. I'll have Stan join. Dan will be there. If you have any questions, as we do some of our gardening stuff, I'll make sure I link what we are learning on that group. So it might be a way for people in this group to continue to be connected. It would also be great if you posted next steps that you're taking from what we've done here. Like if you do some gardening, or if you're starting some new health practices. Maybe we can even get Barb to take some pictures and somehow get somebody to post them of her garden this year. So yeah, it'd be a great way to stay connected that way. Let me just see here. Might even just a small amount of self-grown, garden-grown food be health improving? Stan?
Yes.
I've never grown a garden. I just know that the more you can get closer to the source and the more that you can trade off. I mean, the more you eat this, the less you're going to eat of that. You know what I'm saying? So, I mean, it's just like obviously, even just starting, see it as a needle, that if you can kind of continue to shift more and more of your nutrition. Dan, you talked about the biome. There's a biome in your gut that you feed as well. Have you all heard the phrase, you are what you eat?
Yes. Yeah.
Well, it's not true. See, you are what you ate. So, you know what I mean? Like the things that feed your body are, you have to ask, what were those things? So if it's refined food, it's bankrupt. So that food, has gone through a series of highly significant environmental footprint, all the things to create that product. But when you look at an apple, for example, one that was organically grown versus, sprayed, all the little bugs that live on there and all the wonderful things that, are in our food system, you really are not just what you eat, but it's what those things ate beforehand. That's why the whole toxification of our soils is such a vital, vital issue that's going to impact us, in ways that we probably can't even guess today, down the road.
I absolutely think that any amount of trying to grow stuff is beneficial. So, I mean, Dan and I, we've lived in a number of different contexts. Before we were on the model farm that we're on right now, we had a huge issue with monkeys stealing anything that we tried to grow. So we were very limited to what we could grow, and we could only grow anything that was in a cage. So we ended up having a system where we grew things in containers and had to build a cage to put on top of that just to try and get something that we could eat that the monkeys wouldn't steal. And so what we did, because we were so limited, was we grew like what we could eat for a salad. And we would grow our lettuce, cucumbers, some of our tomatoes, little baby ones. And then we would know that at least once a day when we're having our salad, what we're all of what we're eating in that salad, we had grown. And we had only 4 containers. they're all covered with these cages to stop the monkeys from stealing our food. I don't think you can start too small.
No, I want to encourage you, if you haven't grown food and you're inspired to start really small, get some experience, don't worry about scale. If you looked at Barb's garden, you would either be really inspired or overwhelmed, because you would think, oh, I can't grow on this scale, so I'm not even going to try. I just want to encourage you, grow something. Grow one tomato plant if that's where you want to start. Learn, grow, benefit from what you eat. It's not about scale. And it's not about what you don't have. Oh, I don't have a large area. Well, what do you have? And be faithful with that. We're constantly teaching people, it's not about what you have, it's about being faithful with what you have, even if that's just a little bit. And the promise is, as we're faithful with a little, God adds to us in miraculous ways.
And the whole idea of this being a process is so important, because you can go and visit Barb at her garden and see this incredible garden and say to yourself, you know, that I could never achieve that. But if you're really serious, and if you really believe in this idea that, you know, of health and taking care of yourself and taking care of the land, you begin to make small lifestyle changes that move you in that direction. And that's essentially what my husband and I have done. You know, we've made small lifestyle changes. It's taken us 30 years, but we now have land. We were faithful with a very small, everywhere we've been, we've planted a little bit. And just like in the parable of the talents, God has given us more, and he's allowed us to manage more. And now we have the incredible privilege of managing a small model farm. That principle we teach to people that are very poor and believe they have nothing. But if they just even apply one small thing with what they have been given, everybody's been given something in their hand, even if it's a balcony. There's a balcony that has sun, that can have a pot on it.
Use that.
You know, you would be amazed that when you're faithful with one small thing, God will give you the opportunity for more. And we've seen that even with the poorest of the poor, how they start, and if they are truly faithful and they apply with their small piece of soil, God gives them more. And that's development. That is sustainable development. I'm just going to go back to each one of the panel members now. Just ask them to review for us 3 practical points that they feel might help you with something that you can actually act upon out of this session. Maybe we start with Barb.
3 practical points. Well, the first one obviously is plant a garden.
Yeah, that's what we would say too. No matter where you are, that would be, get growing.
But as everybody has said, your perception of a garden may need to be changed in the beginning. So a garden can be 1 tomato plant on the south side of your house, where you probably will have needed to amend the soil a great deal, because if you live in the suburbs, you probably have only 3 inches of topsoil or something like that. So you're going to need to get your soil so it's in decent shape, and put your 1 or 2 tomato plants, and make sure your water is easy to get at. And another thing I think for somebody, and I know you've got some gardeners online, but if you didn't have gardeners online and somebody really wanted to start a garden, and still, like, we didn't really talk about, we talked a little bit about starting a garden, but there's so much to know to have it be a success. And you have to start small. If you don't start small, it's that 1 step at a time thing that works, right? If you start too big, you know, the weeds may overtake, or you may go on vacation and forget to get your neighbor to water when it was really hot. Your garden's going to fail. You need to start small. what was I going to say? Oh yes, a website that I found that was really good was commonsensehome.com/garden. And they talk about, well, they talk about, you know, things like some crops like cool and some crops like heat or thrive in that, you know, and they talk about frost dates and row spacing or whether to plant in beds. I love to plant in beds, but some people don't plant in beds. But they tell you really important things that it may take you years to learn if you were just learning trial and error. So plant a garden, number one. Number two, you got to get going on it, I guess, because of the season. You can't say, oh, I'm going to plant a garden. Yes, I am. And the end of June comes rolling around and you haven't done it yet. So I would say you have to get going on it right away. If you can't plant a garden, I would locate your closest farmer's market. And yes. The phone and the dog. Because that's your next, and maybe do that at the same times, because that's your next best way of getting fresh produce, or finding a local farmer who will sell by, some farmers sell by boxes. You can go once a week and you can get fresh vegetables from the garden. And the other thing I think I would say is stay away from the center of your grocery store. See if you can find things healthy to eat around the outside of your store, and just one step at a time. Don't say, I'm never going to go into the middle. I think Stan said it right. There are some things that taste really good in the middle, but you don't want to live on them. They're the special things. Okay, step 3.
That's awesome. And somebody had just asked a clarification of the website. If you go to Common Sense Home, I see that Common Sense Home does come up on Google.
It says it works now.
Oh, it works now. Okay, yeah. So that's commonsensehome.com, and then there's a gardening portion that you can go to on that website.
Mm-hmm.
Stan, what about you? Just a review of 3 practical steps.
Yeah, I think first, when we now view health as part of our spiritual growth, I think we have a greater chance at staying with it and journeying in this way for the long haul. And I'll give reiterate maybe a couple of the habits in a sec, but there's, if I don't go to one scripture, I'm going to burst. So I have to do this. So to kind of set it up, and that is, there's, for years and years as a pastor, I would even teach on this, but Ephesians chapter 5, verses 28 and 29, we love to use it in our wedding ceremonies and all that. Let me read it for you and then move on. And we're very familiar with this, but in Ephesians 5, it says, husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. In the same way, husbands ought to love their wives. How much should they love their wives? As their own bodies. Well, then it gets, this next part is almost an indetectable comment that Paul makes, and I've missed it for years. And it says this, after all, no one ever hated his own body, but he feeds and cares for it just as Christ does the church. And I think there's a word in there for all of us, is that as we journey down this road, is to feed and care for our bodies, as we've been encouraged to do so today. There, now I feel so much better. I'm going to move on.
Well done.
So I would say one practical step you could do is just, get a journal and start tracking what you're doing, because it's so easy to go a week down the road. And it's like, you kind of almost forgot. It's like hearing the sermon and then what was the point? And we kind of forget things quite easily. So if you just even have, like, you don't have to write a half a page a day, but even if you just had a way of tracking, and if you need that, you can always buy one off my website, but you really don't need to. You can just make your own way of tracking your habits, so that you have a system for even just putting down a goal. Like if it's going to be to plant something for the first time, or just to take one step of activity, that kind of stuff. So, but a way to track what you do so that 3 years down the road, you can look back and say, I have been on this journey, I'm growing in this way, and you won't kind of forget where you came from. So that's one way, just track. Then it's like, what do I choose to do? And there's such an array. There's a workbook that you can do. It's a free download off of my website under the resources. And in there, I wrote about 10 habits that have been personally transformational to me. They're very simple, but you could just pick one of those habits. Like, I mean, I'll give you a few examples, but one is like, start your morning with a large glass of water. It's super important. Many of you are practicing that already, but it fires up your metabolism, gets your, flushes out toxins, so many things. So I write about that. Or you could just simply pick, if you're going somewhere for the day, is to actually pack a healthy snack so you're not susceptible to just whatever, and you got to have a game plan. So you could go through there and pick one of the 10 healthy transformational habits, and then just track it. And then this one here, I mean, get outside every day. Like, just go for a walk. You don't have to become a runner like me. But walking is one of the most healthy things we can do. Like, just start with what you can handle, and then just continue to move forward as you're able to. And I just think that when we develop these things as daily practical habits, our life begins to feel a whole lot better. And so those are just some very simple things you could do.
Cool. If you have trouble walking, you need to buy a dog.
Yeah. Dogs are fantastic ways to get you out of the house. Absolutely. I wholeheartedly agree.
They'll take you for a walk.
Yeah. Dan, 3 points?
I'll give maybe 2, just
Okay.
because of time and because I resonate with all the points that have been given. I'll start with a real practical one. If you're interested in getting into gardening, maybe you haven't before, also nurture an interest in composting. You can use your garden scraps to start cold composting. If you're interested in learning more, one of the best resources I've seen is the Rodale Book of Composting. It might even be available as an ebook. The reason I mention composting is compost is such a huge key in gardening. There's so many benefits, from pH buffering to feeding the biology in the soil. It's your best soil amendment possible. It amends sandy soil. It amends clay soil. I could go on and on. Compost is key. I call it black gold. So consider that. You can purchase compost. Calgary has a program where they turn everybody's garden scraps into compost that you can pick up for free. So I don't know what the quality is like, but compost.
You can always make better compost than you can buy, though. And if you make your own compost, all the ingredients are free. So it's a free resource. And that, again, when we work with people that are low income, we can show them that they can make the best fertilizer from free ingredients.
And then secondly, just want to encourage us all, and I'm talking to myself big time here, is just a mindfulness around our buying and eating choices, not only relative to our own health, but also to the health of creation. We're called to steward creation. God taught Adam how to work and care for creation. As we care for creation, creation looks after us. So, for example, when we buy those highly refined foods, those factory-made foods in the center of the grocery store, those things are bad for our bodies, but it's also really, really bad for the environment. The more I learn about how those foods are grown and how those foods are manufactured, the more I learn about the environmental degradation that comes from those choices. So that mindfulness around ecology, when you look after your soil, when you grow a garden properly, you're enhancing creation. So it's not just about your physical environment around your home or at your garden. It's about the impacts of our choices in purchasing and in what we eat on the larger scale with the industrial food system.
So somebody's just asked, can you compost with supermarket veggie scraps?
Yes. Yes.
And I mean, you might be worried about pesticides on skins and stuff like that, but I think in general, if you're moving towards trying to do natural things, like and again, we teach this to people in South Africa. Every step that you take, we believe is blessed. You know, when you move in a direction to try and make a change, there's an element of God empowering you. So we've seen him restore fields that were completely infertile, just because people were faithful in trying to implement a few small things in the first season.
Compost is decomposed organic matter. The decomposition happens through the fungal and bacteria that's action on that organic material. Those same microbes also break down any harmful pesticide residues that might be on those kitchen scraps. So yes, compost.
And then one more question is, there was a problem, somebody had composting, but they had a rodent problem. Are there any suggestions around what to do about rodents that are trying to get into the compost?
Buy a cat.
Yeah.
Good one.
If you can believe it, our biggest issue is monkeys stealing stuff from compost. The one thing that we do in South Africa is we choose to do hot composting. That I think would be a huge deterrent to rodents. You can actually go to the Inando Development Facebook page. We've got a full video on assembling a hot compost pile. You need space for that, but that compost pile will get up to 70 degrees Celsius plus. That has a very different effect than your cold composting. So that would be a deterrent to the rodents. We're going to bring this to a close. I want to thank our panel speakers tremendously. You know, we didn't know how this would work. This is the first time we've tried this. I really appreciate Stan, Barb, and Dan from being willing to do this pilot. I think you would all agree it's been hugely interesting to see the different perspectives. It's been interesting to see the connections. So I just want to remind you where you can get resources. Stan's website, thehealthproject.ca. That's correct, hey Stan? That's correct. Okay, thehealthproject.ca has lots of resources. He's available to contact him through that website if you have any questions. Our website, Inando Development. Inando is I-N-U-N-D-O. That comes from the English word inundate. inandodevelopment.org. There's resources there. There's an Inando Development Facebook page. There's lots of resources and videos there. You can look and see our journey of transforming the model farm. Plus, I've started that Facebook page called Flourishing from the Soil on Up. Sorry, it's a group. It's a Facebook group. We can continue the discussion there if you're interested. We'll be available for questions on that Facebook page, or you can even contact us. So I'm going to say thank you very much.
Sorry to those who submitted questions that we just didn't get time for.
Yeah, I am going to suggest everybody can sign out as they want. We're going to release everyone. There was one other question that had more of a personal focus towards Dan and I, so we'll just stay on for 5 more minutes to answer that question, but everybody else doesn't feel like they have to sit around for that.
Do Stan or Barb have anything they want to add?
Stan or Barb, do you have any last?
No.
Well, sorry, Stan. Go ahead. Oh, ladies before gentlemen. You probably could have mentioned again the Common Sense Home /garden.com/garden. The thing about eating as closely to the way things are grown as possible. It's just a nice way of helping you make decisions when you might be having difficulty.
And I just wanted to say thank you for everyone who invested their time today. And thank you to Dan and Carrie and to Barb. I feel like I'm sitting at the feet of masters. I've got things I can learn now, or I'm always learning, but things I can actually do. And so, yeah, just thank you for making this happen. It wouldn't have happened without your vision. So way to go.
Yep.
Thank you all for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, we're going to sign off. I'm actually going to stop the recording. So thank you very much, everybody.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.